How can cultures that never met, separated by oceans and millennia, all remember the same catastrophe? A world drowned, a chosen survivor emerged from the devastation, life beginning again. From Mesopotamia to the Bible, from Greece to indigenous Americas, the flood myth appears everywhere. Why? The answer lies buried in ice, carved in stone, and written in the oldest texts humanity ever created. How can so many ancient cultures remember the same disaster? Civilizations that never communicated, never traded, never even knew the other existed, and yet they all tell stories of a massive flood that destroyed the world. Is Noah's flood a unique miracle, or is it one chapter in a much older story? Here's what most people don't realize. The Noah story didn't come first, not even close. After the last ice age ended, sea levels rose dramatically, about 120 meters in total. Coastal plains vanished, river deltas flooded repeatedly. These weren't abstract events, they were existential threats to early human settlements. Fast forward to ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, modern-day Iraq. By the 3rd millennium BCE, the Sumerians had built large cities and developed one of the world's first writing systems. And what did they write about? They wrote about a catastrophic flood, among other things. The Sumerian King List, one of the oldest historical documents we have, divides history into 2 eras, before the flood and after. It literally says, then the flood swept over. But here's where it gets interesting. The Sumerians didn't just mention a flood, they told a detailed story about it. A story with a survivor, a story with a boat, a story that predates the biblical account by more than 1,000 years. The earliest versions we know of is called the Eridu Genesis, from around 1600 BCE, though the story itself is older. Then comes the Atrahasis epic, from the 18th or 17th century BCE. Then the flood story embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, compiled in the 1st millennium BCE, but drawing on earlier sources. And finally, centuries later, we get Genesis, the Noah narrative as we know it, likely compiled between the 5th and 3rd century BCE, drawing from at least 2 different textual sources. So the Noah story isn't the original. It's the latest version of a narrative that had already been evolving for over a millennia. Let me introduce you to Ziusudra. He's the king of a city called Shuruppak, and he's essentially the original Noah. According to the Eridu Genesis, the gods created humanity and established cities and kingship. However, due to reasons that the broken tablet does not fully explain, the gods decide to destroy humanity with a massive flood. The god Enki, sometimes called Ea, takes pity on Ziusudra, but there's a problem. The other gods have forbidden warning any human, so Enki comes up with a clever workaround. He doesn't speak to Ziusudra directly. Instead, he speaks to a reed wall, knowing Ziusudra is on the other side listening. Enki tells him to build a large boat, and to save animals and the seed of mankind. The flood comes, a violent storm lasting 7 days and 7 nights. When it's over, Ziusudra opens a window in the boat, offers sacrifice to the gods, and is rewarded with eternal life in a blessed land. Sound familiar? A righteous man warned by a god, a boat built to specific instructions, animals saved, a catastrophic flood, a sacrifice afterward. These are the exact same story beats that appear in Genesis, but written down over 1,000 years earlier. The Atrahasis epic gives us even more detail. Written in Akkadian, it explains that the gods created humans to do their labor, but humans multiplied and became noisy. So noisy that the chief god Enlil couldn't sleep. First, he tried plagues and droughts to reduce the population. When that didn't work, he decided on a flood. Once again, Enki secretly warns the hero, Atrahasis, instructing him to build a boat and save life. The parallels to Genesis are stunning. But what's even more stunning is that the Gilgamesh flood story contains lines that are almost word for word identical to Atrahasis. These Mesopotamian scribes were copying and adapting the same core narrative across centuries. The hero gets a divine warning. He builds a boat to precise dimensions. He brings his family and animals aboard, A massive storm destroys all life. The boat eventually comes to rest on land or on a mountain. The hero sends out birds to test whether the waters have receded. And finally, he offers a sacrifice, and the gods, or in the biblical version, God, makes a promise about the future. This occurrence is far from coincidence. It is a living literary tradition, being reworked and retold across Mesopotamian culture for well over 1,000 years before the Hebrew Bible was compiled. So we have these stories. Could any of this have actually occurred? In the 1920s, a British archaeologist named Sir Leonard Woolley was excavating the ancient city of Ur when he found something extraordinary. A layer of clean, sterile silt, 3 to 3.5 meters thick, sandwiched between occupation layers. No artifacts, no pottery, just mud. Woolley was convinced he'd found evidence of Noah's flood. He dated the layer to around the mid-4th millennium BCE and declared it proof of a single, massive deluge. But as more research was conducted, the interpretation fell apart. The flood layer at Ur was significant, yes, but it was a local river flood, not a global catastrophe, and it wasn't the only one. At the city of Kish, archaeologists found multiple flood layers from different time periods, around 3000 to 2900 BCE, and another around 2600 BCE. At Shuruppak, the very city where Ziusudra was said to have lived, soil analysis revealed about a meter of water-laid sand and clay dated to roughly 2900 BCE. So what does this tell us? Several early Mesopotamian cities experienced serious floods, but these floods occurred at different times. They were geographically limited, and they match exactly what we'd expect from catastrophic local floods in a low-lying river delta. The archaeological consensus today is clear. There's no evidence of a single global flood, but there is abundant evidence of recurring, devastating local floods that would have traumatized entire generations, the kind of events that become legend. For the Sumerians, the flood wasn't just a story, it was a historical marker. The Sumerian king list divides their history into 2 distinct periods. Before the flood, it lists the kings with impossibly long reigns, tens of thousands of years. These are clearly mythical figures. Then comes the line, "Then the flood swept over." After that, kingship descended from heaven again, this time to the city of Kish, and the reigns become somewhat more realistic, eventually leading to historically verifiable rulers. What this tells us is profound. For the ancient Sumerians, the flood was the pivot point between mythic prehistory and actual history. It was their version of the Big Bang, the event that reset everything. Now let's talk about one of the most controversial scientific theories connected to flood myths, the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis. In the late 1990s, marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed something dramatic. They argued that around 7,600 to 9,400 years ago, rising Mediterranean waters breached a natural dam at the Bosphorus Strait and catastrophically flooded into the Black Sea, which at the time was a lower freshwater lake. According to their hypothesis, the inflow was equivalent to 200 Niagara Falls. Sea levels in the Black Sea basin rose by tens of meters, drowning vast coastal plains and forcing populations to flee. Ryan and Pittman suggested this event could be the real-world catastrophe behind Near Eastern flood myths. It's a compelling idea. It made headlines. It captured imaginations. But here's the thing. The scientific community is deeply divided on this. Multiple studies since the 2000s have found evidence more consistent with gradual water level changes, not a sudden deluge. Some data even suggests the Black Sea was higher than the Mediterranean at certain points, with water flowing out, not in. And archaeologically, there's no clear signal of mass, sudden coastal abandonment in the proposed timeframe. So where does that leave us? The Black Sea hypothesis remains exactly that, a hypothesis. It's fascinating, and it illustrates how dramatic regional flooding could inspire lasting cultural memories, but we can't point to it as proof of the biblical flood. This is one of many examples of how the end of the Ice Age changed the world. Let's zoom out for a moment and look at the bigger picture. Since the last glacial maximum about 20,000 years ago, global sea levels have risen approximately 120 meters. Indeed, the rise in sea levels have reached approximately 120 meters. Sea levels drowned entire coastlines, river valleys, and low-lying plains, prime real estate for early human societies. And it didn't happen smoothly. There were periods of rapid melting, sudden outburst floods, and dramatic shifts in river courses. Take Glacial Lake Agassiz, for example. This was an immense proglacial lake in central North America, at times larger than any modern lake. When its ice or moraine dams failed, it released catastrophic floods. One final drainage event alone caused global sea levels to jump by about 0.8 meters. These kind of events, called glacial lake outburst floods, or GLOFs, are well documented in the geological record, and they weren't unique to North America. Humanity spent thousands of years living in a highly dynamic water world. Coastlines shifted, rivers changed course overnight, mega floods were real. So how do we get from Ziusudra and Atrahasis to Noah? Most biblical scholars today see the Genesis flood narrative as drawing on and transforming these older Mesopotamian traditions. The structure, the key plot points, even some of the specific details, they're all there in the earlier texts. But the theology is different. In the Mesopotamian versions, you have many gods, often acting capriciously. The flood happens because humans are too noisy, or because the gods regret creating them. In Genesis, there's one God, and the flood is a response to human moral corruption. The emphasis shifts from divine whim to divine justice, and also divine mercy, as seen in the covenant and the rainbow. The Genesis text itself shows signs of being compiled from at least two sources. That's why you encounter small contradictions, like animals entering the ark in pairs versus 7 pairs, or the flood lasting 40 days versus 150 days. Scholars call these the priestly and non-priestly sources, likely woven together during or after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, a time when Israelite scribes would have had direct contact with Babylonian literature and culture. So here are two frameworks, and you can hold either one or both. The historical critical view says Israelite authors encountered Mesopotamian flood traditions and reworked them into a distinctly Israelite theological narrative. The faith-based view says God communicates profound truths through imagery, language, and stories familiar to ancient listeners, including existing flood traditions. The question may not be whether Genesis knew these earlier stories, but what it wanted to say through them. But is there geological evidence for a recent global flood? The answer, according to modern geology, is no. Sedimentary layers, ice cores, fossil records, and tree rings show no evidence of a single worldwide flood in the last tens of thousands of years. That doesn't mean nothing happened. It means the scale and the mechanism matter. Some Christian geologists and theologians have proposed that a large regional flood, maybe in Mesopotamia or the broader Near East, could be the historical kernel behind the biblical story, possibly occurring in the early Holocene or Neolithic period. Science asks, how big, when, where? Theology asks, why? What does it reveal about God and humanity? These are different kinds of questions, and they don't necessarily have to be in conflict. This video isn't trying to disprove belief. It's exploring how memory, myth, and real disasters intertwine. It's asking, what if both the science and the stories are telling us something true, just in different languages? Ancient people carved these stories into stone because water could erase everything they knew in a matter of days. Whether you see Noah as history, parable, or both, the story says something essential. Human choices matter. The world is fragile. Renewal is possible, but not guaranteed. And here's the uncomfortable truth. We're living through our own age of floods. Rising seas driven by modern climate change are already forcing migrations and erasing coastlines. Extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and more severe. We are, in a very real sense, facing the same existential questions our ancestors faced when they looked at the waterline creeping higher and higher. Thousands of years from now, if someone digs through the ruins of our cities and reads the stories we left behind, our scientific reports, our news archives, our debates, what will they think our floods were trying to tell us?